Lunchtime.
A policeman at a county jail unlocks a cell block for the inmates to head out to have lunch in the cafeteria. As they walk out, the cop realizes that there's one person left.
Do you really think he'd be stupid enough to kill me?
He then walks to the cell of a man named Jake Fratelli and sees that he has hung himself. The cop looks shocked by this, but as he reads the note Jake left, he realizes that the inmate is not dead. Before he can do anything, Jake knocks him out and escapes with his brother, Francis, and his mom, Mama Fratelli, who are already waiting for him outside, despite setting the entrance of the county jail on fire.
I don't have the handle, open the lock!
The Fratellis are still chased down by the cops. A boy named Chunk sees this as they pass the front of his house, and he looks quite excited. After a while, Mama Fratelli drives the car off the road and loses the cops.
What the hell are we doing here? Trusted your old mother, boy!
Elsewhere, a boy named Mikey looks bored in his house while his brother, Brand, is lifting weights in his room. Mikey says he doesn't really care about the town, and he can't even wait to leave the house already. Brand asks if he really means what he said, but Mikey says he's just trying to delude himself. It turns out that all the residents in their neighborhood, called Goondocks, are about to lose their homes due to a foreclosure, and they have just a day left before they're sent away. After Mikey and Brand head to the living room, one of Mikey's friends, Mouth, comes over to visit them. He then notices that Mikey is looking sad, and he says he can't believe they're not spending their final moments in Goondocks in the best way possible. Shortly after, Chunk also arrives at the house to see Mikey, but Mouth doesn't want him to come inside until he does a special dance. Chunk says he just saw something really amazing, but Mouth thinks he's lying. Mikey eventually lets him into the house, and Chunk talks about the police chase he saw earlier. His friends don't believe him because he has a history of lying about his experiences, but Chunk says he's telling the truth this time.
Then the time you ate your weight in Godfather's Pizza.
After a while, a boy named Data also enters the house to meet Mikey and the others. Data is one of Mikey's friends who likes creating several gadgets for different purposes. As the friends start talking about having to leave Goondocks, Data asks if any of them has heard of Detroit before. Mouth says he has, and that it's the place with the country's highest murder rate. Data says it's where they'll be moving when they lose their houses the next day, but Mikey tells him to stop talking negatively. He adds that his dad will fix the issue and ensure that they won't have to leave. Brand says it's not happening because their dad, Mr. Walsh, doesn't have enough money, but Mikey also tells him to stop saying negative things. Shortly after, their mom, Mrs. Walsh, comes in with a lady named Rosalita. She then mentions that Rosalita is there to help them pack their things until her injured arm gets better. As she adds that she'll need a translator because Rosalita only speaks Spanish, Mouth says he can do that because he understands the language.
Mrs. Walsh, I speak perfect Spanish.
Mrs. Walsh appreciates this, and she tells him to follow her so he can give Rosalita some instructions on the things she has to do. As she goes through all the tasks, Mouth translates the wrong things and ends up scaring Rosalita about the house. Mrs. Walsh doesn't know this, and she believes that Mouth is doing the right thing. Rosalita and Mrs. Walsh eventually leave the house to buy some things in the market, and Mouth asks Mikey about his dad's things, which are in the attic. Mikey says his dad will be giving them back to the museum, but Mouth suggests checking them to see if they'll find any rich items they can sell or keep for themselves. Mikey doesn't agree with this, but his friends and brother don't seem to care. As they run to the attic, Mikey eventually follows them. After seeing the old artifacts inside there, Mouth says he can't believe Mikey has many cool things in his house. Mikey keeps trying to get his friends not to mess with the things in the attic, but they don't listen to him. As they eventually ask where his dad got the artifacts, Mikey explains that the museum once held a show on the history of a place called Astoria, and the items in the attic are some of the things that were rejected and not displayed. Chunk jokes that they are also rejects like the items, and he calls his friends the Goonies. Mouth says he's not a reject, but Mikey seems to be more concerned about getting them to leave the attic. Shortly after, Mikey finds an old map, and as he looks at it with his friends, they notice that the words words on it are written in Spanish. Mouth then translates it and says it's a warning for intruders not to go in search of a treasure. Brand then mentions that the map is old news, and it's from when their parents were younger. He adds that the map belongs to a pirate named One-Eyed Willie. Mikey remembers a story his dad used to tell him about Willie, but Brand says it was probably a lie. Mikey doesn't think so, and he mentions that Willie was the best pirate of his time, and he once stole a treasure that contained lots of diamonds, rubies, and emeralds.
And then there was a whole big war.
The British king at the time eventually found out about this and sent his army out to capture Willie. Due to this, Willie had to hide in a cave, but the army blew up the walls to keep him trapped inside. According to the story, Willie spent many years inside there with his men, and they set up booby traps to ensure that anyone who comes in to steal the treasure will die. As Mikey's friends argue about whether they believe him or not, Chunk stumbles upon an old newspaper article about a man named Chester who went in search of the treasure and never returned. Mikey believes the treasure is real, and he suggests going on an adventure to find it. His friends are not so sure about this, and Brand says it's unlikely that the treasure is real because the map leading to something that important shouldn't just be lying around in their attic. Shortly after, a man named Mr. Perkins and his assistant visit the house to leave a document for Mr. Walsh regarding the foreclosure. Brand collects the document, and Mikey looks sad.
You know, I think they made me lose my appetite.
Because they'll really have to leave their house the next day. Brand eventually hugs his brother to console him, and as they enter the house, Mikey talks about his interest in finding Willie's treasure so that he can pay his dad's bills and make him stop the demolition of the homes in Goondocks. Brand says he won't let Mikey go anywhere because their mom will scold him for it. Despite this, Mikey and his friends eventually decide to go on the adventure, and they tie Brand to a chair before leaving the house on their bicycles. Shortly after, Mrs. Walsh arrives home and sees Brand on the floor while he's struggling to free himself. She asks where his brother is, and as he says what happened, he eventually leaves the house to find Mikey and his friends. Unfortunately, he notices that the boys have deflated his bicycle tires, so he steals a small girl's bike. As he heads out on the road, a boy named Troy sees Brand and jokes about how he's riding a small bicycle. A girl named Andy and her best friend Steph are also in the car with him.
Can we give you a ride somewhere?
And they don't seem to get why he's being rude. After he stops next to Brand, Andy asks if he would like them to give him a ride. Brand says he's fine with the bike, but Troy just pins his hand to the car and keeps driving. He eventually throws Brand off the road and finds this funny, but the girls don't seem to be pleased with him. Elsewhere, the Goonies follow Willie's map until they get to a place with a restaurant, which Mikey believes is the place where the treasure is hidden. As they watch the restaurant from afar, they see two men entering the place. Chunk sounds scared because he believes something might go wrong, but his friends assure him that the place is a regular restaurant, and the two men are likely just customers. Shortly after, they walk toward the restaurant to see what they can find. While Chunk quickly runs toward a small cooler to see if he can get a drink, his friends peep through the window and see someone carrying a heavy object into a different room. The kids believe it's just the cook carrying something to the kitchen, but they're unaware that it's actually Mama Fratelli who is doing something shady inside. While walking around, Chunk checks the garage and sees a car with bullet holes in it.
Bullet holes.
As he runs back to tell his friends that something is wrong, they drag him into the restaurant with them. Suddenly, Mama Fratelli appears behind them and asks how long they've been at the window. The boys look really scared, and as Jake comes out of the kitchen, he sees them. Mama Fratelli tells him that the boys are customers, and Jake welcomes them to the restaurant. Mama Fratelli then asks what the kids would like, and Chunk says he needs water. Mouth jokes about wanting an expensive meal, but Mama Fratelli grabs his mouth and says that the only thing they serve is tongue. She then threatens to use a knife to cut out his tongue, and this leaves the kids scared. As she tells them to sit while she brings their glasses of water, the kids start wondering what happened to the men who came in before them. Chunk then mentions what he saw in the garage, but his friends think he's lying. As he tries to make them believe him, Mama Fratelli returns with their order. Surprisingly, the liquid in the cup doesn't look like water, but Mama Fratelli tells them to drink it like that. Mikey Mikey then says he wants to use the restroom,
Hey, Mikey, go to the bathroom.
and Mama Fratelli tells him where to go. Instead of following her directions, Mikey starts looking around and sees a room where Jake is torturing a man named Sloth who is in chains. Jake eventually drops a tray of food on the floor before complaining about how Sloth always stresses him. After Jake leaves, Mikey enters the room to push the tray closer to Sloth. However, as he sees Sloth's disfigured face, he looks scared and runs out. Brand then grabs him and says he shouldn't have left the house. He then carries him out and tells the other kids to follow him, after which Mama Fratelli locks the door. As they get outside, Mikey tells Brand and his friends that he saw a strange man chained to a wall. Suddenly, they see Mama Fratelli and her sons loading something into the back of their car. Even though it looks like a dead body, the kids think it's just restaurant trash. Chunk seems really scared of everything that has happened, and he says he wants to go home. Mikey says they won't have a home in a few hours, and that they need to be worried about that.
Look, there are bullet holes in the car.
He adds that they need to try to find Willie's treasure if it exists. After the Fratellis leave the restaurant, Mikey and the others are startled by Andy and Steph, who mention that they followed the Goonies after ditching Troy for what he did in his car. Shortly after, they enter the restaurant, and while Brand wants them to go home, Mikey suggests checking out the place for just a few minutes. Andy convinces Brand to listen to his brother, and he agrees to let them stay for a while. Mikey then takes them to the room where he saw Sloth, and as they see his face, they look really scared and run out immediately. Shortly after, Mikey says he believes the treasure is under the basement. As he tries to break the ground, Brand stops him and says there's nothing there. Mikey says he's only following what's on the map, but Brand tells him to get over it. Just as Chunk mistakenly breaks a jar of water, the boys hear the sound of the water leaving the room. They then check around the room and see a hole in the fireplace. Brand breaks the piece of wood, blocking it, and the boys realize that the tunnel to Willie's treasure starts from there.
I told you it was passageway.
Almost immediately, Data finds an old machine that can print fake $50 bills. After he alerts the others, Brand says it's fake, and while they all wonder why anyone would print fake money, Steph finds a newspaper article about Mama Fratelli and her sons. Mikey and the others realize that they're criminals, and Chunk says he tried to tell them. As he adds that he's leaving because they never believe him, he starts smelling ice cream and sees some cups inside a nearby room. He then opens the door and starts picking up the ice cream cups, but he and the others eventually notice that there's a dead body inside the room. This makes them freak out, but as they start hearing footsteps in the main restaurant, they stay silent because it means the Fratellis are back. Mama Fratelli senses that someone came inside there after they left, and she tells her kids to look around the place. As Brand and the others think of leaving through the front door, Mikey says they'll be caught and that the hole in the fireplace might be their only way out. Even though Brand is initially reluctant to go through the hole, he eventually heads down there with the others, while Chunk remains stuck with the dead body inside the room. Suddenly, the Fratellis head down to see if anyone has been to the basement. Again, Mama Fratelli says someone has been there, and that they need to check if their brother, Sloth, has escaped. As they leave, Chunk comes out of the room and goes near the fireplace. Mikey then tells him to leave and call the police. Following this, Chunk heads out through the window and starts running away from the restaurant. After a while, he heads to the road and stops a car to ask for help, but it turns out that Francis and Jake are the ones inside. Since they've already heard him talk about how he's going to report them to the police while his friends are still inside the restaurant, they lock him in the trunk, and he looks terrified when he sees a dead body next to him. Shortly after, Mikey and the others see a room with many pipes. As they wonder where the door is, Mouth says they probably have to hit the pipes and make enough noise to force water to gush out and clear a path for them. This affects the taps and water system in the town, but one of the pipes eventually bursts, and the water from it helps them find a clear path to go through. Meanwhile, the Fratellis hold down Chunk and ask for his friends. He says they went down a hole in the fireplace in search of a treasure, but the Fratellis think he's lying. As they ask for more details and tell him to reveal the truth, Chunk starts stalling them by talking about some bad things he did in the past.
One of your tricks, isn't it, one-eyed Willie?
Elsewhere, Mikey and the others reach another room where they find a rotten body. This freaks them out, but as they take a closer look at it, Data says it's likely Chester's body. Mikey doesn't believe this, but Data says it makes sense because Chester was the last person to go on a search for Willie, but he never returned. After Mikey checks the person's wallet, he sees his ID and realizes that it's actually Chester. He also checks Chester's things and sees some candles, which Data keeps in his bag. He then says he's going back to set booby traps in case the Fratellis come for them. While looking around Chester's body, Mikey also finds a key-like object and keeps it. Before they decide what to do next, Mikey sees a rope on the floor, but as he draws it, this triggers a booby trap that makes some large rocks fall into the room. The kids quickly find a place to hide to avoid getting crushed, and Brand suddenly hears a sound behind a rock.
You guys, don't move back there! Don't move!
Steph thinks he shouldn't move the rock, but he doesn't listen to her. As he moves the rocks, some bats fly out of the hole, and the kids are left terrified by this. While the Fratellis are about to hurt Chunk, the bats fly out to the basement, and this gets them startled. Chunk tries to warn Mikey by shouting his name, but his friends are already far away, and they can't hear him. After a while, Mikey and the others see a beautiful fountain with coins all over the place. They eventually realize that it's a wishing well, and that's why there are coins inside. Coincidentally, Troy is standing at the top of the well with his friends, and he throws a coin inside while wishing for Andy to be his girlfriend. His coin gets thrown back, and as he looks shocked, he checks the well and asks if anyone is inside. Andy says she's there, and she tells Troy to throw down the bucket at the top so that she and the others will be able to leave the well. After he does this, Andy climbs the bucket, but before she leaves, Mikey says they really have a good chance of saving their town if they stay back to find Willie's treasure.
Besides, we gotta get to the police.
Andy and the others don't want to end up like Chester, but Mikey tells them that they need to do their best to fight for their homes. His speech moves the others, and they decide against leaving through the well. Elsewhere, the Fratellis decide to keep Chunk alive because he might be telling the truth. They then take him to Sloth's room, after which they head down the hole in the fireplace. Chunk looks scared of Sloth, but as he notices that he's hungry, he throws him a chocolate bar which falls on the ground. Sloth is unable to reach it, so he breaks his chains and picks up the chocolate bar. He then stands up and gives Chunk a part of it. Shortly after, Sloth frees Chunk, and he heads out to call the sheriff to report the Fratellis and talk about everything that's happening at the restaurant. Interestingly, the sheriff knows Chunk as a serial liar who has prank called him many times in the past. Since he thinks it's one of Chunk's prank calls, the sheriff ignores him. As Sloth then goes down the hole in the fireplace, Chunk tries to stop him, but he doesn't listen.
No, son, I'll show you. Don't go down there.
Since he can't just leave him alone, Chunk follows Sloth into the tunnel. Meanwhile, the Fratellis have also gotten to where Chester's body is. They realize that the kids have taken everything he had on him, and they continue looking for them. Elsewhere, Mikey finds a strange lock that requires using the key-like object he found earlier. After he inserts it into a hole and moves it, this triggers another booby trap that makes Data fall into a hole. Luckily, Data uses one of his gadgets to avoid falling to his death. The others are relieved to see this, and Data tells them that there's another room down there. Shortly after, Brand sees the Fratellis nearby, and he quickly alerts the others to run. After crossing a small log of wood to get past a pool of water, Data puts oil on it.
Hey, fellas, remember me?
So that the Fratellis won't be able to get to them. Luckily, this works out well, and Jake and Francis nearly fall into the pool after stepping on the oil. After this, Mikey and the others enter a room with a bony structure that looks like a piano. As Mouth reads an instruction on the map, he realizes that they need to play the right notes on the bones, or they'll die. Since Andy is the only one who has taken piano lessons before, they all push her forward to play the bones. Andy says she can't remember it because she was still young, but Mouth shows her the notes at the back of the map and tells her to try. As Andy taps on the first key, a door gently opens, and they all realize that it will only open completely after playing the notes. Unfortunately, Andy makes a mistake by pressing a wrong key, and a part of the ground they're standing on breaks off. This scares them, and they tell Andy not to make any more mistakes. Despite this, Andy makes another mistake, and the ground keeps breaking off. They're left standing on the last last available space, and as Andy presses the right keys, the door fully opens, and they all walk through it. They eventually fall into an underground water slide that leads them into a river, where they see Willie's ship. The kids are happy about this, and they immediately climb up to see what's inside. Unfortunately, they don't see any gold on the ship, and Mouth and the others start blaming Mikey for allowing them to risk their lives for nothing. As Andy mistakenly pulls a rope inside the ship, it unlocks a top compartment where the Goonies see Willie's skeleton sitting in front of a table filled with all kinds of precious stones and gold. Mikey looks happy to have found what they came for, and even though Willie is already dead, he introduces himself and his friends to the one-eyed pirate. He then tells his friends to pack all the things they can, while they leave the ones on a scale for Willie. Shortly after, the Fratellis enter the ship, and Data tries to use one of his gadgets to hit them, but nothing happens. Mama Fratelli then tells them to drop all the things they picked up from the ship. As they're doing this, Mouth appears to have hidden some pearls in his mouth, but Mama Fratelli tells him to remove them. Following this, Mama Fratelli decides to throw them off the ship. Andy is thrown off first, and Bran jumps down to save her from drowning. Before Mouth and Steph are pushed down, Sloth shows up with Chunk, and they save the other Goonies. They then enter the river while Sloth takes down Jake and Francis before tying them up. Mama Fratelli begs him not to throw her off the ship, but he blames her for disfiguring his face. Before she can explain herself, Sloth throws her into the river. As the kids are about to find a way out, Mikey says they can't just leave all the gold because they need it to save their future. However, Brand says they won't have a future if they don't leave immediately. They then see a hole leading out of the cave. Brand says he can't see where they'll pass through, and Data remembers that he still has the candles he took from Chester's things. As he lights it up, Data looks surprised when it starts sparkling, and Brand realizes that it's a dynamite.
Is there a way out or what?
He immediately throws it near the rocks, and they all jump into the water. Elsewhere, the Fratellis return to Willie's cabin to take the gold inside there. As Francis touches the gold on the scale, it triggers a booby trap, and he tells Jake and his mom that they need to leave. After the dynamite explodes, the cave starts collapsing, and a rock is now blocking the exit. As the kids wonder how they'll carry it away, Sloth decides to help them lift it up so that they can go outside. Chunk is the last person to head out, but he doesn't want Sloth to be left behind and crushed in the cave. Despite this, Sloth tells him to go because someone has to lift the rock. After Chunk gets through, Sloth is unable to hold the rock for longer, and he drops it just as his mom and brothers swim toward him while the cave starts falling apart. Shortly after, Mikey and the others make it out to a beach.
They weren't here a minute ago. But they're here now, Dan.
Where they're seen by some police officers. A while later, they're reunited with their families, and they look happy to have made it out alive. Sloth and his family eventually come out of the water, and the cops go after them. The Goonies stop them from arresting Sloth, but his mom and brothers are taken away. Chunk then invites Sloth to come and live with him, and he agrees. Just then, Mr. Perkins reaches the scene and tells Mr. Walsh to sign the foreclosure papers. The Goonies look disappointed by this, but as Mr. Walsh is about to sign the document, Rosalita sees something in Mikey's jacket and tells him to wait. The Goonies stop Mr. Walsh from signing the foreclosure papers, and Rosalita shows them the marbles she found in Mikey's jacket. Mikey realizes that they now have what they need to keep their homes in Goondocks, and Mr. Walsh tears the papers and says he won't be signing anything. They all look happy about this, and some reporters show up to ask the kids how they found the marbles. While Chunk is talking about the things they saw and how they dealt with the booby traps,
Yeah, and see that on the pirate's treasure.
the sheriff thinks he's just making up things again. As Chunk is about to defend himself, the sheriff sees Willie's ship drifting out to sea. Everyone looks amazed by this, and Mikey blows it a kiss and says goodbye to Willie. With the homes in his neighborhood at risk of being demolished, Mikey teamed up with his friends to find a long-lost treasure. Despite encountering dangerous and scary booby traps in the cave, Mikey never gave up, and he even encouraged his friends not to abandon their quest. Luckily, they found what they were looking for, and even though they couldn't take all the gold, it eventually turned out that they had all they needed to save their homes. Sometimes courage and teamwork are all you need to overcome the toughest challenges.